Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Matthew Scott. I'm president of the Carnegie Institution for Science, and I'm glad you, in the middle of preparing for holidays and things, that you took the time to join us tonight for what I'm sure will be an absolutely fascinating talk. This is a joint project tonight of the Kavli Institute and the Council of Scientific Society Presidents and Carnegie. And we love working with each other and hope to have many more such lectures in the future. So to introduce tonight's speaker, I want to bring up Robert Barsley, who is the chair of the executive committee of the Council of Scientific Society Presidents. Bob.
Dr. Scott, thank you, and I'd like to add my welcome to you who have come here to see this program tonight. The Council of Scientific Society Presidents really does appreciate its collaboration with Carnegie Institution for Science and our opportunity to be here tonight. CSSP is a federation of scientific research societies whose members work together to promote funding for and understanding of the full range of science and engineering and to advance science and technology leadership. We are delighted to be working with the Kavli Foundation and to present the Fred Kavli Science at the Frontiers lectures twice each year. And it's my distinct honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. FRITJOF Capra. Dr. Capra is a Vienna-born physicist and systems theorist. He first became popularly known for his book, The Tao of Physics, which explored the ways in which modern physics was changing our worldview from a mechanistic to a holistic and ecological one. Published in 1975, it remains in print today and in more than 40 different editions worldwide, and is referenced with the statue of Shiva in the courtyard of one of the world's largest and most respected centers for scientific research, CERN, the Center for Research in Particle Physics in Geneva. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Capra has been engaged in a systematic exploration of how other sciences and society are ushering in a similar shift in worldview or paradigms, leading to a new vision of reality, a new understanding of the social implications of this cultural transformation. He is a founding director of the Berkeley-based Center for Ecoliteracy, which is dedicated to advancing ecology and systems thinking in primary and secondary education. The primary focus of environmental education and activism has been to help build and nurture sustainable communities. He believes that to do so, we can learn valuable lessons from the study of ecosystems, which are sustainable communities of plants, animals, and microorganisms. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our speaker, Dr. FRITJOF Capra, who will present the Systems View of Life, a Science for Sustainable Living.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you for this nice introduction and welcome. It's a great honor and a great pleasure for me to give this prestigious lecture. And I would like to thank Dr. Robert Barsley and Dr. Martin Appel for inviting me. Today, it is becoming more and more evident that concern with the environment is not one of many single issues, but is the context of everything else, of our lives, our businesses, our politics. The great challenge of our time is to build and nurture sustainable communities, designed in such a manner that their ways of life, that is, their businesses, economies, physical structures, technologies, and so on, do not interfere with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. The first step in this endeavor, naturally, needs to be to understand how nature sustains life. And it turns out that this involves a whole new ecological understanding of life. Indeed, such a new understanding of life has emerged in science over the last 30 years or so. At the forefront of contemporary science, the universe is no longer seen as a machine composed of some elementary building blocks. We have discovered that the material world ultimately is a network of inseparable patterns of relationships. We have also discovered that the planet as a whole is a living, self-regulating system, the well-known Gaia theory. The view of the human body as a machine and of the mind as a separate entity is now being replaced by one that sees not only the brain, but also the immune system, the bodily tissues, and even each single cell as a living cognitive system. Evolution is no longer seen as a competitive struggle for existence, but rather as some kind of cooperative dance in which creativity and the constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. And with the new emphasis on complexity, networks, and patterns of organization, a new science of qualities is now slowly emerging. During the last 30 years, I developed a synthesis of this new understanding of life, a conceptual framework that integrates 4 dimensions of life. The biological dimension, naturally, but also the cognitive dimension, the social dimension, and the ecological dimension of life. I presented summaries of this framework as it evolved over the years in 2 books, The Web of Life, published in 1996, and The Hidden Connections, published in 2002. My final synthesis is published in a textbook titled The Systems View of Life and co-authored by Pierluigi Luisi, professor of biochemistry at the University of Rome. I call my synthesis The Systems View of Life because it requires a new kind of thinking in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns, in terms of context. And in science, this thinking is known as systemic thinking or systems thinking. Now, systems thinking in terms of relationships, is crucial for ecology, because ecology, the name, as you know, derives from the Greek oikos, household. Ecology is the science of relationships among the various members of the Earth household. I should also mention that systems thinking is not limited to science. Many indigenous cultures embody profound ecological awareness and think of nature in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns. The well-known Native American saying, "all my relations," when they talk about nature, is an example. The same is true in traditional Chinese philosophy and in many Eastern spiritual traditions. And this was what I explored in my first book that Dr. Basley mentioned, The Tao of Physics, published in 1975. Now, during the last 10 years, I've been fascinated by the science of Leonardo da Vinci, the great genius of the Renaissance. And I discovered that his science is a science of living forms, of interconnected patterns and processes. In my book, The Science of Leonardo, I argue that Leonardo da Vinci was a systemic thinker, an ecologist, and a pioneer of what we now call ecodesign and biomimicry. But back to modern science. Systems thinking emerged in the 1920s from a series of interdisciplinary dialogues in Europe involving biologists, psychologists, and ecologists. And in all these fields, scientists realized that a living system, an organism, an ecosystem, or a social system, is an integrated whole whose properties cannot be reduced to those of smaller parts. The so-called systemic properties are properties of the whole which none of its parts have. Let me give you a very simple example. When you take sugar, and we all know sugar tastes sweet. Where does the sweet taste come from? Well, we can go into chemistry and study the pattern of atoms that form a particular compound, which we call sugar, and they are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. Now, the carbon doesn't taste sweet, the oxygen doesn't taste sweet, and the hydrogen doesn't taste sweet. So where does the sweetness come from? It comes from the particular relationship, the pattern of relationships among those elements. And that is true in general for systemic properties. The early systems thinkers expressed this insight in the now well-known phrase, "the whole is more than the sum of its parts." Now, systems science also tells us that all living systems share a set of common properties and principles of organization. And this means that systems thinking can be used to integrate academic disciplines and to discover similarities between different phenomena within the broad range of living systems. During the 1970s and 1980s, systems thinking was raised to a new level with the development of complexity theory, technically known as nonlinear dynamics. This is a new mathematical language that allows scientists for the first time to handle the enormous complexity of living systems mathematically. Chaos theory and fractal geometry are important parts of complexity theory. And this new nonlinear mathematics is a mathematics of patterns, of relationships. When you solve a nonlinear equation or a set of nonlinear equations with these new techniques, the answer is not a formula, but the answer is a pattern, and you program the computer to trace out that kind of pattern. The strange attractors of chaos theory and the fractals of fractal geometry are patterns of this kind. They are visual representations of the system's complex dynamics. Now, during the last 30 years, there has been tremendous new interest in nonlinear phenomena. In science, those of you who work in science will know that nonlinear phenomena have been around for a long time. But when we went to school and learned our branch of science and the mathematics that goes with it, you will remember we were always taught the first thing you do when you encounter a nonlinear equation is you linearize it. Because you can't solve the nonlinear equation, so you replace it by something else, which is not the real thing, but it's linear and it can be solved. Well, all this changed dramatically in the last 30 years when computers came on the scene and scientists and mathematicians developed new techniques to actually solve nonlinear equations. And so this very strong interest in nonlinear phenomena has dramatically increased our understanding of many key characteristics of life. And my synthesis of these theories is what I refer to as the system's view of life. Now, to present it properly would take a whole course, or at least a weekend seminar. And actually, I'm now teaching such a course online. For the first time, I'm teaching online, and I must say I really enjoy it. I've done it for 2 years now, and I have a global audience of participants, each time of about 150 to 200 from around the world, over 50 countries so far around the world. So if you're interested in that, it's called CAPRA course for PR reasons and easy way to remember. So tonight I can give you only a few highlights of this systems view of life. And one of the most important insights of this systemic understanding of life is the recognition that networks are the basic pattern of organization of all living systems. Ecosystems are understood in terms of food webs, that is, networks of organisms. Organisms are networks of cells, organs, and organ systems, and cells are networks of molecules. So the network is a pattern that is common to all life. Wherever we see life, we see networks. Indeed, at the heart of the change of paradigms from the mechanistic to the systemic view of life, we find a fundamental change of metaphors from seeing the world as a network, from seeing the world as a machine, to understanding it as a network. Well, these living networks have been investigated very closely over the last few decades, and this examination has shown that their key characteristic is that they are self-generating. In a cell, for example, all the biological structures in the cell, the proteins, enzymes, the DNA, the cell membrane, and so on, all these structures are continually produced, repaired, and regenerated by the cellular network. And similarly, at the level of multicellular organisms, the bodily cells are continually regenerated and recycled by the body's metabolic network. So living networks continually create or recreate themselves by transforming and replacing their components. And in this way, they undergo continual structural changes while preserving the web-like patterns of organization. And this coexistence of stability and change is indeed one of the key characteristics of life that has been known for a very long time. Now let me move quickly from the biological to the social realm. Life in the social realm can also be understood in terms of networks, but here we don't talk about chemical reactions, we talk about communications. As you all know, social networks are networks of communications, and like biological networks, they are self-generating. So, what is generated in social networks is mostly non-material. You have a network of communications, somebody says something or posts something on, say, social media, somebody else picks up the conversation, adds something, elaborates, and so in this way each communication triggers other communications and the entire network sustains itself. And over time there is feedback and there is some kind of self-regulation, and what emerges then is a shared system of knowledge, of values, and of rules of conduct, a common context of meaning, which we call culture. This is what culture is, and this culture of a social system is continually sustained by further communications. Now, I'm sort of rushing you through this. I could spend the whole rest of the hour just talking about this dynamics of culture, which is extremely interesting. But let me move on to what is perhaps the most important and most radical philosophical implication of the systems view of life. And that is a new conception of the nature of mind and consciousness, which finally overcomes the Cartesian division between mind and matter that has haunted philosophers and scientists for centuries. You will remember that in the 17th century, René Descartes, the great French philosopher and mathematician, based his view of nature on the fundamental division between two independent and separate realms, that of mind, which he called the thinking thing, res cogitans, the thinking thing, and that of matter, res extensa, the extended thing. And following Descartes, scientists and philosophers continued to think of the mind as something, some kind of intangible entity, and were unable to imagine how this thinking thing is related to the body. The decisive advance of the system's view of life has been to abandon the Cartesian view of the mind as a thing and to realize that mind and consciousness are not things but processes. This novel concept of mind was developed during the 1960s by Gregory Bateson, who used the concept mental process, and independently by Umberto Maturana in Chile, who focused on cognition, the process of knowing. Their central insight is the identification of cognition, the process of knowing, with the very process of life. Cognition, according to Maturana, is the activity involved in the self-generation and self-perpetuation of living networks. In other words, cognition is the very process of life. The self-organizing activity of living systems at all levels of life is mental or cognitive activity, and the interactions of a living system, a living organism, say, a plant, an animal, or human, or a microorganism, with its environment are cognitive interactions. Now, this is a vast extension of the concept of cognition and a radically new concept. And in this way, life and cognition are inseparably connected. Mind, or more accurately, mental activity, is immanent in matter at all levels of life. So, for the first time now, we have a scientific theory that unifies mind, matter, and life. Again, this would take a long time to really go into details, but I also want to emphasize that my synthesis of the system's view of life is not only theory, but has very concrete applications. In the last part of our book, titled Sustaining the Web of Life, we discuss the critical importance of the system's view of life for dealing with the problems of our multifaceted global crisis. Today, it is becoming more and more important, but it's becoming more and more evident that the major problems of our time, energy, environment, climate change, economic inequality, violence and war, and so on, cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. And I know you probably can't read the words here. I put this up only to impress you, to show you how all these problems are interconnected. In our book, we analyze this in detail. And let me also say that this graph is based on the analysis of Lester Brown here in Washington at the World Watch Institute and then later at the Earth Policy Institute, one of my great environmental heroes. Well, these systemic problems require systemic solutions, which means solutions that do not solve any problem in isolation, but deal with it within the context of other related problems. Now, unfortunately, this realization has not yet dawned on most of our political and corporate leaders, who are unable to connect the dots, to use a popular phrase. Instead of taking into account the interconnectedness of our major problems, their so-called solutions tend to focus on a single issue. And in this way, they simply shift the problem to another part of the system. For example, by producing more energy at the expense of biodiversity, public health, or climate stability. Moreover, our leaders refuse to recognize how their piecemeal solutions affect future generations. What we need is solutions that are systemic and sustainable. Over the last few decades, the research institutes and centers of learning of the global civil society have developed and tested hundreds of such systemic solutions all over the world. In our textbook, we devote about 60 pages to detailed discussions of these systemic solutions. They include, just to give you a few examples, proposals to reshape economic globalization and restructure corporations, new forms of ownership that are not extractive but regenerative, a wide variety of systemic solutions to the interlinked problems of energy, food, poverty, and climate change. And finally, the large number of systemic design solutions known collectively as Ecodesign, which embody the basic principles of ecology. Well, to conclude, I want to return to the concept of ecological sustainability. As I have mentioned, a sustainable human community is designed in such a manner that its ways of life, businesses, economy, physical structures, technologies, and so on, do not interfere with the inherent ability of nature to sustain life. The first step toward a sustainable future must be to understand how nature sustains life. And to do so, we need to move from biology to ecology, because sustained life is a property of an ecosystem rather than a single organism or species. Over billions of years of evolution, the Earth's ecosystems have evolved certain principles of organization to sustain the web of life. Knowledge of these principles of organization, or principles of ecology, also known as ecological literacy or ecoliteracy, is crucial for designing sustainable human communities. In the coming decades, the survival of humanity will depend on our ecological literacy, on our ability to understand the basic principles of ecology and to live accordingly. And this means that ecoliteracy must become a critical skill for politicians, business leaders, and professionals in all spheres, and should be the most important part of education at all levels, from primary and secondary schools to colleges and universities, and the continuing education and training of professionals. We need to teach our children, our students, and our political and corporate leaders, if you wish, the fundamental facts of life. For example, that one species' waste is another species' food. That matter cycles continually through the web of life. that the energy driving the ecological cycles flows from the sun, that diversity assures resilience, and that life, from its beginning more than 3 billion years ago, did not take over the planet by combat, but by partnerships and networking. Now, if we could just get this last one through to the people in Washington, it would be a big change. Well, all these principles of ecology are closely interrelated. When you study them in detail, you really see that they all depend on one another. And in a way, they are just different aspects of a single fundamental pattern of organization that has enabled nature to sustain life for billions of years. In a nutshell, nature sustains life by creating and nurturing communities. No individual organism can exist in isolation. Animals depend on the photosynthesis of plants for their energy needs. Plants depend on the carbon dioxide produced by animals, as well as on the nitrogen fixed by bacteria at their roots and other microorganisms at their roots. And together, plants, animals, and microorganisms regulate the entire biosphere and maintain the conditions conducive to life. So sustainability is not an individual property, but a property of an entire web of relationships. It always involves a community. This is the profound lesson we need to learn from nature. The way to sustain life is to build and nurture community. A sustainable human community interacts with other communities, both human and non-human, in ways that enable them to live and develop according to their nature. Sustainability does not mean that things do not change. It is a dynamic process of co-evolution rather than a static state. So this knowledge, ecoliteracy, is the first step on the road to sustainability. The second step is ecological design. We need to apply our ecological knowledge to the fundamental redesign of our technologies and social institutions so as to bridge the current gap between human design and the ecologically sustainable systems of nature. Now, design, you could say that design in the broadest sense consists in shaping flows of energy and matter for human purposes. That's sort of an environmental definition of design. Shaping flows of energy and matter for human purposes. Ecological design, in the words of environmental educator David Orr, is a process in which our human purposes are carefully meshed with the larger patterns and flows of the natural world. Ecological design principles reflect the principles of organization that nature has evolved to sustain the web of life. Now, to practice design in such a context requires a fundamental shift in our attitude toward nature. A shift from finding out what we can extract from nature to finding out what we can learn from her. In recent years, there has been a dramatic rise in ecologically oriented design practices and projects, all of which are now well documented. They include, just to give you a few examples, a worldwide renaissance in organic farming, the organization of different industries into ecological clusters in which the waste of any one organization is a resource for another. Similarly, the shift from a product-oriented economy to what eco-designers call a service and flow economy, in which industrial raw materials and technical components cycle continually between manufacturers and users. Then we have green architecture, a very lively field, with buildings that are designed to produce more energy than they consume, emit no waste, and monitor their own performance. We have hybrid electric cars achieving fuel efficiencies 2 to 3 times that of standard cars, and the development of efficient hydrogen fuel cells that promise to inaugurate a new era in energy production. So these eco-design technologies and projects all incorporate the basic principles of ecology, and therefore they have some key characteristics in common. They tend to be small-scale projects with plenty of diversity, energy efficient, non-polluting, community-oriented, and labor-intensive, in this way creating plenty of jobs. The technologies available now provide compelling evidence that the transition to a sustainable future is no longer a technical nor a conceptual problem. It is a problem of political will and leadership. Now, such leadership is not limited to the political domain. Today, there are 3 centers of power that need ecologically literate leaders: government, business, and civil society. And I believe that the cooperation between these 3 centers of powers will be crucial for moving toward a sustainable future. This is an enterprise that transcends all our differences of race, culture, and class. The earth is our common home, and creating a sustainable world for our children and for future generations is our common task. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you. I believe we have time for questions, and there are 2 microphones. If you would go to these microphones in the corridors here. Yes.
So I would like to hear more about what you foresee as the process by which we can transform, say, a capitalist or communist or socialist government organization into one that's more likely to be long-term sustainable?
Well, I think the process, there are 2 kinds of processes. The one is political activism of the Bernie Sanders type. That's one kind of process. And concurrently, we also need to create alternatives. It's not enough to say, not that Bernie doesn't know about alternatives, but it's really important to emphasize the creation of alternative structures. I can recommend very highly a book that talks about this. In the lecture, when I talked about new forms of ownership that are generative, not extractive, I was referring by a book called Owning Our Future by a woman whose name just escapes me now. But she was actually here in Washington, and she was the publisher of a journal called Business Ethics for about 10 years. And I will remember her name. But anyway, the book is called Owning Our Future. And she went around the world as a journalist to look at new types of ownership, cooperatives, new ways of doing business, and found some very exciting examples. Yes, over here, let's go.
Thank you very much for the talk. The most radical thing that I heard you propose was the cognitive theory of the cell and matter. Can you explain, has that theory been tested experimentally? If so, could you explain how? If not, can you think of a way that it could be tested?
Well, I think the test, you're right that we need to test new theories in science. It's not enough to say, now we call cognition the process of life and we associate it with the process of life. We also have to show whether this has some actual advance. And I think conceptual clarity, I think, is the most significant result. Think, for example, of the age-old question, what is the relationship between the mind and the brain? And for centuries, philosophers and scientists have puzzled about this question and haven't known an answer. In the book, I cite a textbook of neuroscience, which is maybe 20, 30 years old, and the authors in the preface say, we know that the mind is somehow related to the brain, but we don't know how. So they don't have a clue. Well, with this new theory, which by the way is known as the Santiago theory of cognition, with this new theory, the relationship between mind and brain is very clear. It's a relationship between process and structure. The mind, cognition, is the process of knowledge, and it is embedded in the brain. The brain is the physical structure in which this process takes place. So very clearly, the relationship between mind and brain is a relationship between process and structure. To me, this is a tremendous advance. Now, you can also go into immunology. Our knowledge of the immune system has improved. Sometimes the immune system is called the second brain. And when you apply these concepts of cognition to various phenomena in immunology, you also get greater clarity. So that, I would say, are the main tests. But I should also say that this theory is at its very beginning and now needs to apply it to various phenomena and various problems in science. And so there's a whole open field now which is ready for exploration. Yes, please.
Thank you. Your observation about the tendency of politicians to focus on one problem at a time rather than systematic solutions led me to wonder how, in the context of that very good slide that you had put up about system solutions, those 4 areas about economic globalization and generative ownership and the problems of climate change and poverty and energy and so on, plus the last one on eco-design. From a policy point of view, those are all, from a systems point of view, connected, but we can't seem to do them all at once, practically speaking. So is there a critical path, or is there one, for example, that can help generate the others or stimulate the others to happen? If we have to start somewhere, where best to start and how best to make that keep going?
Yes, well, the solutions now exist and they are being tested and have been tested in various places. I often talk about sustainable agriculture as an example, also known as agroecology. That's a systemic solution par excellence, because just think, if we transformed our current industrial system of agriculture, which is energy intensive, mechanically oriented, highly centralized, involves toxic chemicals and so on. If we transformed this into a sustainable system of agriculture that is community oriented, that uses only organic ingredients, and so on, then this would solve at least 3 of our major current problems today. One, the energy problem, because today we use about 20% of our fossil fuels for agriculture, for growing, processing, and transporting food. Now, agroecology has no energy inputs, so it would be a tremendous saving. 2, the food that is growing this way is far healthier than the industrially produced food, so there will be a tremendous impact on public health. We know that many of our major diseases, such as strokes, diabetes, and others, are a direct consequence of our diet. And 3, it would help enormously in fighting climate change, and this is, by the way, something that is not generally known. It needs to be disseminated, this knowledge, that an organic soil is an organic soil, a living organic soil is carbon rich, because carbon is the backbone, the chemical backbone of life. And so where does the soil get the carbon? It draws it down from the atmosphere. The bacteria and other critters in the soil draw it down from the atmosphere. And so it has been estimated, if we transformed just the most degraded parts of our agricultural fields into organic soils, that would draw down all the carbon that we currently emit. So, you know, organic agriculture or agroecology is a tremendous tool for drawing down carbon. We know that we need to reduce our emissions of carbon, but even if we manage that, that's not enough, because there is already too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we need to draw down carbon, and the only technology we know that draws down carbon is photosynthesis. So we need it to do with, you know, planting trees, new grasslands, and organic agriculture. So this is a systemic solution that has been tested and applied in various sustainable farms, family-owned farms around the world. One of the big experts are in Cuba, in the Cuban urban agriculture, but it has been applied throughout the world, in Argentina, in southern Brazil, in Europe, in many other places. And so this knowledge needs to get through to the Department of Agriculture and the political system. How to do that, I don't know. That's a big challenge. Yes?
I'm interested what work is being done around these solutions using computer modeling and artificial intelligence in the future, what role you see, because the complexity of these things seems so enormous and beyond our the ability to grasp on some level. You know, is that part of any solution that you envision?
Well, I'm not an expert on artificial intelligence, but there's, we saw before, there's a talk coming up on pediatric robotics. Then maybe you should ask them this question, but certainly computer models are central to what we're doing. Because when I talked about nonlinear dynamics, the mathematics of complexity, that's all computer-oriented. And the big change from linear to nonlinear mathematics came with the development of powerful computers. And that's the same for modeling climate and modeling various things in agriculture and other fields. Ecodesign works with computers. When you design a new car that is, ecologically sustainable, although that's a big issue, of course, with cars in general, but it has to be done with computer modeling. So computers are essential. Yes?
I'm curious about your vision of the future of energy. So it seems like there's clearly a detrimental effect resulting from carbon creating energy sources that have been used in the past, like coal and fossil fuels. And in order to transition away from those, we're going to have to move to cleaner sources of energy, like solar or wind. But in order to create the infrastructure for those systems, we're going to need to use extractive methods. For example, like the solar panels are, and all the technology that's being produced now is created from rare earth minerals like cobalt and lithium, and then just the energy consumption at its current rate. I've read or heard that there are people who argue that nuclear power, which has had devastating effects on the environment and pollution, aside from like not having to do with the carbon output, that's going to be play an essential role in the continuation. Do you think that there are other sources of energy that can be harnessed, or is it necessary for those extractive processes to take place in moving towards a sustainable future?
Yeah, now this is a very important question, and my view is that we have all the solutions today. We have all the sources of energy, but the solution is not to say we go with wind, or we go with solar, or we go with biofuels, or we go with nuclear. The solution is a combination, and it also involves redesigning our cities, redesigning our transportation systems, saving energy in our technologies, making them more energy efficient. The sort of world champion in this field is Amory Lovins, a former physicist who is the founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado. And he and his colleagues published a book a few years ago called Reinventing Fire. And this is a roadmap toward a safe, sustainable future using renewable energy sources and redesigning our existing systems. And it promises to be free of fossil fuel, independent of fossil fuels by 2050, and to make a lot of money for the various industries that go into that. So it's not something that costs anything, it's something that makes a lot of money. And regarding nuclear is not part of the scheme simply because it's not viable commercially. Nuclear power has to be supported by states or governments or other entities, but it's not viable on the free market because it's far too costly.
So you emphasize the importance of community, and one of the things that's changed a lot in human societies with population growth is the scale of societies, and it seems like most of the systems you talked about, they were organized as a series of levels. So is there anything about the organization of communities and maybe multiple levels of communities that's suggested by your theory that could help people figure out how to more effectively organize social interactions to achieve some of these more sustainable approaches?
Well, I'm not sure whether I fully understand your question, but let me say that there are so-called intentional communities or alternative communities that live according to the kinds of ideas that I presented. There's a global network of eco-villages, for instance. And, there are hundreds and thousands of people who live in communities in a sustainable way. There's also the international transition movement that started in the UK with the Transition Town movement, that where towns and cities undertake to move toward a transition away from fossil fuels, including, redesigning their energy systems, redesigning their cities, and also redesigning their processes of decision-making, government, and so on. So a lot of this is going on.
I guess, just to restate it, it would be like, is there a way to organize communities of communities that would leverage some of the repeated levels of organization that you pointed out that are typical of life? that might be directly suggested or
Yes,
not?
I think when you think of a community as a network, and a community of communities would be a network of these networks, and these exist, like this global transition movement is a network of networks, and the global network of eco-villages is a network of networks. So these things do exist. Yes?
So in looking at the existing solutions that you've listed, it seems like many of these come with a certain monetary price tag that not everyone can afford. So what do you suggest in terms of making sure that the lowest socioeconomic classes are also participating in the systematic solutions if you kind of can't get out of the cycle in this capitalist context?
Yeah, of course, you know, you cannot go to a poor neighborhood and tell people you have to live in such a way, you from tomorrow on you buy only organic vegetables because that's the way to go. They can't afford it. But why can they not afford it? Because there's not a level playing field. Organically grown vegetables should be cheaper than commercially grown, industrially grown vegetables. They should be cheaper because they're grown locally, they're grown without energy input, they're grown without artificial fertilizers and so on. The reason why they're not cheaper is that industrial agriculture gets huge subsidies from the government, and organic farmers don't get these subsidies. So there's not a level playing field. So we need to have a strategy that has a mix of, you know, financial support for poor communities, and at the same time working on changing the political system in such a way that a level playing field is created. Not an easy task, of course. Yes.
An important input to any of these models must be population. And how do you deal with the growth rates of population around the world?
Yeah, a very important question. And I must say, when I looked through the literature, and I've worked on this for several decades, as I told you, and when I looked through the literature about alternative systemic solutions, I noticed that most people don't talk about population growth. Most of the environmental movement does not talk about population growth. And I must say again, Lester Brown, who worked and lived in Washington, D.C., he's now retired. I don't know whether he still lives here or whether he moved back to his farm. But I feature his book, Plan B, which is one of the big summaries or overviews of systemic solutions, next to Amory Lovins, whom I mentioned, with Reinventing Fire, and then there's there are others. There's a book, the third big summary is the one by Jeremy Rifkin, who also lives here in DC, and it's called The Third Industrial Revolution. Anyway, back to Lester Brown. In his book, Plan B, he starts out with population growth. He puts it right up front. And he points out that demographic studies over decades have shown that population growth is closely linked to social justice, especially it's closely linked to women's rights, to the right of women having equal access to education, to financial resources, to land, especially in the southern hemisphere, and so on. And that dramatic changes in population stabilization can be made by working for social justice. And he goes into great detail and shows how this can be done. By the way, in the first question I mentioned in my answer the book Owning Our Future, and I remembered the author now. Her name is Marjorie Kelly. So that's the book, Marjorie Kelly, Owning Our Future. Yes.
I'm more interested in philosophical and social side of your lecture. At first you mentioned in the philosophical radical connotation of your lecture is about about the system of life is mind is immanent in all things. Like, can you expand on that? Does it require?
I didn't say in all things, in all living things.
In all living things.
Yes. Well, this, you see, this new view of cognition says that every living organism is a network. It is a self-generating and self-organizing network. And the dynamics of self-organization, the process, this coordinating process of this self-organization, which involves perception of the environment, response to environment, and then organization inside the system, all this is cognitive or mental activity. That's the new conception of mind. And in this way, mind or cognition becomes associated with life at all levels, whether or not there is a brain and a nervous system. And as in evolution, as biological structures evolve and become more and more complex, so the self-organizing activity, that is cognition, becomes more and more complex, and at a certain level, a coordinating organ evolves, which is the brain and the nervous system, and then at some level we have the emergence of self-awareness, excuse me, the emergence of self-awareness, which we then associate with consciousness. So that is the basic framework. But I have to tell you that it has taken me many years to really absorb and understand that, so I don't expect you to accept and understand it right off the bat.
Just a very quick follow-up. Would you call yourself like in your lecture, it seems like nature is the God. Would you like to call yourself like an eco-fundamentalist?
Would I call myself an eco-fundamentalist?
Yes, there are 4 levels of like social groups, social level, ecological level, but it seems like everything is subject to the force of ecology, and it's like it should be the fundamental principle that other principles should be followed by or following. Like it's like this is the most important thing, and perhaps like I don't know whether it should be a balance or a leading one.
No, I definitely would reject the label of fundamentalist, and I think you may get the impression because when you give a short lecture about a vast topic, you have to select and you have to organize the lecture in a certain way, and so this impression may arise that I overemphasize one thing and not so much. But I can assure you that in our textbook, The Systems View of Life, all these dimensions are interdependent, and it's not a fundamentalist approach at all. Yeah. Please. Eco-mentalist? Oh, I thought fundamentalist. I don't know. Okay.
Thank you for your scholarship and your thought processes. A question: in the search for testing the Santiago principles, do you think we have the conceptual tools, at least in the English language and in the current mathematics to get at this, or are we sort of back in sort of the Tao of physics thing in trying to compare these physical processes to the E, to the G, to conceptual philosophical processes that we still don't have a physical entity that we can tie to in sort of the Western cosmological structure, scientific structure?
No, I don't agree with that. I think we have the conceptual tools. We even have mathematical tools. The second great scientist next to Umberto Maturana in the Santiago theory was Francisco Varela, and he had a great skill in mathematics and constructed mathematical models and used new conceptual tools. But I must also say that there is a difference here between cognition, which is at all levels of life, and consciousness, which involves self-awareness and conscious lived experience, and that emerges at the level of mammals and then the great apes and humans. And in order to understand consciousness, the standard scientific tools are not enough, because the data of consciousness are first-person inner experience. So we need self-observation in terms of contemplation, or what philosophers call phenomenology, disciplined self-observation of experiences of consciousness. And other people have also drawn parallels to, say, theories of consciousness developed in Buddhism. So yes, there is a branch that goes in this direction. But I think we can also deal with this Santiago theory and its implications with our current conceptual tools. The problem is not so much conceptual tools. The problem is the well-known academic rigidity that people in various disciplines shy away from these new concepts because they are so radical. We would have to rewrite our textbooks, restructure our courses and so on. But that's what we have to do.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. You said earlier, while you were answering a question, that advanced systems of cognition develop eventually an organ, brain, to oversee it. So animals do that, but the Earth, a ecosystem that's far more complicated than ours, where would you say the brain of the Earth, or rather the universe, is?
Well, the Earth is understood now as a living system, and therefore has cognitive abilities and is intelligent. Whether or not it is self-aware is a different question. And in my view, the whole humanity, are the brains of the Earth and the self-awareness of the Earth. And so, the Earth, if you want to put it metaphorically, speaks through us in either, constructive or destructive ways. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Glad they found you some water.
Yeah.